This episode is brought to you by our partner, Ice Barrel. Cold therapy was an integral part of my training. When I was a gymnast, I would be in that cold tub after every training session for a number of years, and it's still something I take part of as part of my recovery, my mental health, as well as my performance in and out of the gym. Please check out their FAQ page for everything you need to know about Ice Barrel and cold therapy. If you've never tried cold exposure before, we cannot recommend Ice Barrel enough. They have events all over the US, and we also introduced Conscious Therapy as an added session at our Power Monkey camp. It was a huge hit with our campers and coaches alike. We cannot wait to have them back again. Please use Power Monkey, that's all caps, Power Monkey, no spaces, and save $75 off your Ice Barrel. Welcome to the Power Monkey podcast, where we chat with the best in the world of fitness about what they do. I'm your host, Dave Durante, with my co-host this week being Mike Service and Jordan Samuel, and we are talking movement once again. Yes, the kipping handstand push-up, something that we talked about quite a bit on the podcast over the last couple of months and years, but something that still needed some additional attention. Should you be doing the kipping handstand push-up if you are an everyday athlete? Should you be doing a kipping handstand push-up if you are a competitive athlete? We go back and forth on these important subjects. We talk a little bit more about some recent studies that have been done around the kipping handstand push-up within our population. It's a good starting point. Probably some more research needs to be done, but we are moving in the right direction in terms of the proper conversations that need to be had. We hope this kind of enlightens you a little bit more in terms of our approach to the kipping handstand push-up, and hopefully you can reach out some more with some questions you have about your specific needs and wants as an athlete, as a coach. Enjoy. All right, welcome everybody. Another movement podcast today. I got my buddies Jordan and Mike, and we're going to be going through the kipping handstand push-up. Should you be doing the kipping handstand push-up in a workout? Should you not be doing it? What are the pros and cons of this particular movement pattern? We've discussed it quite a bit over the years on different podcasts, in person at our camps. And we're going to try to dive a little deeper into it, especially after having put a post out on this not that long ago and getting some responses from the community. And before we kind of get into some of the more of the nuance, I wanted to ask each of these guys where they stand on the kipping handstand push-up. We'll start with you, Mike. What do you think of the movement pattern? Do you do it? Do you recommend it? Where you stand on kipping handstand push-ups?
I mean, I consider myself an expert on this topic, all things inversion.
I'm not going to lie. I saw you doing a handstand. We were together the other day, and your handstand has gotten phenomenal, like really, really impressive. In fact, the person that I was with, who's known you for a while, was even commenting like, Mike's handstand's gotten pretty darn good. So, Mike, I think you at this point you can speak on the topic of inversions with some real pride.
A little bit of validity, yeah. But no, handstand push I'm not very strong in. So, all jokes aside, and getting back to a serious note, for kipping handstand push up, I personally have done them. I have to admit, I have done them. I do not do them, and I think because I was pretty late to the game of being upside down. Whenever I did do them, I was generally lowering pretty slow and trying to find like the, let's say, iconic Power Monkey tripod position. So I was always trying to like line up far enough away from the wall to be able to come back down into what would feel like I could just be in a headstand if needed with a good support. And then that kind of turned into anytime I've made recommendations for people or anybody that I coach personally that will do handstand push-ups, if they're dead set on doing kipping, I've always had them with like a 3-second lower into a soft touch of the head onto an ab mat. So like I would usually have them put their hands on a deficit and then have to rest their head on an ab mat. So that was usually like, or has been to this point, still kind of my compromise for people that are wanting to be prepared for them in competition. But I don't naturally prescribe them to anybody, and I don't personally like to try them. I'm very much on my level. I'm working to want to have the freestanding handstand push-up. One of the more true expressions of the movement. So that's what I'm working on personally.
Before we get to you, Jordan, I just want to ask a follow-up question to that, Mike. Have you found that you've been able to get buy-in from people around doing tempo work on specific skills within, say, Metcon, where, this is something I bring up quite a bit, where, eccentric work and pause work is so critical in building positional awareness and strength through those ranges, like we talk about endlessly, but it's kind of challenging when you're telling someone 3, 2, 1, go as fast as you can, but then on this movement, you're mandating a 3-second tempo descent. but still trying to go as fast as you can to create a good time. Like, have you felt like you've had any pushback on clients having trouble with that?
Not so much, mainly because the ones that, let's say, have come to me later on in their CrossFit career, a few that I can think of had like neck problems, so they like hated doing handstand push-ups. And then when I told them to do it like this, they're like, "Oh, great!" Because like I would either, skip the WOD or just be ready to have a stiff neck for the next 3 weeks. And the change in time in their workouts wasn't like crazy because thankfully, even like most recently, we just don't see that many kipping handstand push-ups in workouts. Maybe Jordan, when we get into your opinion, maybe we can talk even a little bit about the quarterfinal workouts that just came out because there's some good handstand push-up components in there. But I've had more buy-in than pushback. I think most people too that are also seeking, more structured training and coming to a group of coaches like we are that have some more expertise in specific movements are usually looking for rationale and the why of why they're doing something, not just because it could be in competition, but how's this going to affect me later on? And yeah, if I have a stiff neck and then I can't do half the other exercises in my program, like, was it a good idea?
It's an older, wiser situation too. It sounds like a lot of your clients
Definitely.
have been through, you know, injuries and are understanding that if they want to be doing these things for longevity and later into life, that maybe there's a smarter way to approach certain things. But Jordan, what about you?
Well, surprise, I'm not a big fan of them either. I've
But you
done
were
a
a
lot.
competitor. Out of the three of us, you were the one that competed the most.
Mm.
Competed at regionals, have probably done them in competition settings quite a bit. Where were you on them early on in your career versus maybe where you are now?
I mean, I didn't think there was anything wrong with them early on, just because that's what everybody was doing. And so I thought that's what I was supposed to be doing. And so it wasn't, I mean, I didn't actually have a really strong handstand push-up in general. My volume and endurance wasn't great. So at one point I asked my coach to help me with that, and he programmed just a ton of kipping handstand push-ups almost on a, daily basis. And just to get that exposure. And it was during that time that I really jacked my neck up pretty good. And I had to go see a specialist to kind of help work that out. And I, ever since then, have had a aversion to them. And I think that was prior to me getting too involved with Power Monkey. And then when I did get involved with Power Monkey, I was really grateful and relieved to hear your stance on the kipping handstand push-up, because it kind of added, validity to what I sort of stumbled across through just trial and error. And thankfully, I don't coach any higher level athletes like Mike and you do. So the people that I coach, it's a much easier buy-in to get them to do a modification in a workout that might call for handstand push-ups, and kind of put less emphasis on trying to do what those athletes at the games are doing, or trying to make sure you've got the best RX time on the board, or any of these other things, because they're all, for the most part, daily, more interested in longevity, and those sorts of things. So I'm grateful for that, because I do understand that with some people it's challenging to really get them to agree with that point of view. And that was evidenced by the fact that we had a number of posts or comments on our post, which we can get into after we hear your standpoint, Dave. But people on both sides of the aisle. But one of the reoccurring themes for people that were for kipping handstand push-ups, it was, but this is what you see in competition, and how are you supposed to compete if you can't do kipping? So
Hmm.
maybe we can get to that once you give your opinion. That can maybe be our first question.
Sure. I think if anyone has listened to the podcast up to this point, they've probably heard me say this many times to the point where they can probably verbatim recite the response I'm going to give. But it's not something I do. I have done plenty of workouts with kipping handstand push-ups over the years. I shied away from it because one, I preferred strict. I felt like it was a movement that was strong for me. So for me to get the same stimulus that it was getting for other people who were doing kipping, I needed to do strict. So most of the time I was doing strict handstand push-ups, even when I first started doing CrossFit workouts, 15 years ago. Um, but when I would do a kipping handstand push-up workout, I noticed that it was bothering my neck and spine, and this is coming from someone that, considers themselves to be pretty in control with inversions and pretty good at being able to control themselves down to the bottom position. And it was still bothering me. So I didn't do it when they would come up in workouts just because I found it to be, limiting my ability to perform and work out post keeping handstand push-up workouts. And so I think our whole approach here is less about competition and more about what is going to create the most healthy, capable person that we come in contact with as a client. And so the response has to do more with what are we trying to do from longevity perspective, and then you can back into the response around competition because I think they are unique responses, but we're trying to deal with what's best from the everyday athlete that's coming in contact with this type of movement pattern, what's going to allow them to do it for as long as possible rather than an open workout or quarterfinals as we're seeing we just announced recently. This is going to be released post quarterfinals, but it will be interesting to see how people approach this with regards to, one interesting workout that has 3 different variations in it for handstand push-ups. So, I'm not someone that is going to prescribe it. I don't do it myself. I don't think that the everyday athlete going into a CrossFit gym should be doing them. And like we said, we're probably going to have a separate conversation around competition versus everyday just fitness levels. But from my perspective, it has very little value for the everyday athlete out there.
So totally agree with that. To kind of touch on the comments that were coming in through social media and you were just sort of getting to with the competitor side versus everyday athlete side. I mean, it is important to identify that those are 2 separate things. So I know we're going to focus more on the everyday athlete, but when it does come to a competitor, do you think that they should be doing it at all?
Well, I mean, this is
I
a
guess
touchy
let me
subject.
rephrase that. Do you think that it should be programmed in competition?
That's the better question, and my answer is no. Like, I don't think it should be a movement pattern that is done in competitive settings. I think the thing that I've mentioned many times that one, even just back to wall handstand push-ups have very little value outside of that specific movement. Like we're always training towards, a higher level variation. So that's why I was so happy when Boz introduced wall facing deficit back a couple of years ago, because it was the first variation that we saw with handstand push-ups that actually had value to working towards eventually a freestanding deficit, eventually towards a ring handstand push-up. And so from my perspective, it doesn't have value. It's a dead end skill movement pattern. And so from that perspective, I don't see it having a ton of value. And also, I think it's more convention at this point, why it's still in there, that it was initially put into CrossFit workouts and Diane was, named 20 whatever years ago, and people are doing it just because they want to test times around a convention of a movement pattern that's been in the space since the inception. And so I think that's something that we are slowly, and I said this before, that I don't have any inside information around this, but we're seeing kipping handstand push-ups much less often these days in main site workouts, in open workouts. When was the last time you saw a kipping handstand push-up in an open? I mean, they've switched. If there's any inversion now, it's normally a wall walk or something like that. So I think there is some acknowledgement from CrossFit that it's not a movement pattern that the everyday person should be doing. But I think it's going to be extremely challenging for people to change their mind or to change their thinking when it comes to it, because it is fully ingrained within the community at this point in the competition setting. The one last thing I will mention on this, and we talked about this when we had Boz on the podcast a little while back, is the variation that does not put weight on your head, but still kipping, where you're doing a deficit on parallettes or between blocks or boxes or plates, and you can kip through that movement pattern. The main concern is dropping weight onto your head, neck, and spine. And so if you're using the hips to open up to generate power, to kind of go through movements more quickly, okay. If you're doing it without dropping your head onto the ground, I can see some value there and for the purposes of creating a stimulus of going faster. But In situations where the head does come in contact with the ground, I see very little value for that into the future.
Yeah, and I to your point about, the CrossFit community in general starting to become a little bit more aware of this, it's showing up less and less in competition and so forth. Kind of along those same lines, we came across a friend of ours, Chris Gotti, incredible hand balancer, circus performer. He was involved in a study that was measuring the forces on the cervical spine and the head and these sorts of things during the kipping handstand push-up action. So we looked at the study and it's not perfect, but in my mind, there was one really interesting takeaway that I think is worth noting. And you were talking about bringing the head down onto the ground and there being force there. And that's what I think all of us initially are thinking is the area of concern, crashing down on your head. That's a lot of force. But they showed a force curve throughout the entirety of the rep. And the thing that was most interesting to me was that when the most force was produced on the head was not when the head was coming down and crashing onto the ground. It was during the kipping action right before it goes up. And so, we were talking about you should be able to control and lower yourself down with control so that you're not crashing. But even if you are a strong athlete, a games level athlete who can do that, you're still putting excessive force on your head through the kipping action, which has nothing to do with your ability to control yourself to the ground. And to me, that was like surprising and very interesting.
Yeah, it was super. It was a very good point, Jordan. I'm glad you pointed that out in the study. And from us discussing it separately, if that's actually happening, the higher level athlete, the one who can generate more force, stronger hips, stronger athlete is probably the athlete that's putting more force onto their head because of their ability to generate more power through their hip on that kipping action. So it's not just the athlete that's incapable of, doing Mike's method of doing maybe a tempo descent on the way down, but it is also the athlete being able to generate so much power on the way up that they're putting additional stress in that area where they're seeing the most stress being had. So just one more note on the study. We'll probably link it into the podcast itself so people can go through it itself. It's by no means a perfect study. In my mind, it's a great starting point. It's great to see the the community starting to put some interest into these areas of need, long-term studies around the benefits, the negatives, the pros and cons around movements that people have been doing for a long time. And finally, we're starting to see some interest in it. So this one needs some definite more work and more in-depth taking a look into. There was only 16 people a part of the study. They were all from one gym. There were no prerequisites around being able to do strict handstand push-ups. And so there were some things that I think we can probably look at a little bit more closely over time, but it definitely is a good starting point.
One of the other bigger questions, or rather comments that were made on one of the posts, this is probably geared more towards Mike with his expertise in weightlifting and so forth. But we had a comment that was asking the question. This was a proponent for kipping handstand push-ups, and he was asking the question, how is generating force through your body and your hips in a kipping handstand push-up when you get tired and coming crashing down and these all sorts of things any different than if you were to be doing a high rep set of push press or push jerk and you're getting tired and the weight's coming crashing down onto your shoulders or onto your back or wherever? How is it any more or less safe than that other situation?
I would have a two-part answer to that one. I would say it's part one is it's not any different, but it's more severe. So like from my perspective as a weightlifter, your goal is not to be dropping heavy weights on any part of your body under fatigue. Yeah, in a sport like CrossFit, it's inevitable at some point in time, but you want to minimize it for sure. So it's always, I think Dave and I have this conversation every single weekend course that we're at. And then every rotation at camp there's always the questions of, if I'm competing at the highest level versus I'm training because I want to be strong, healthy, and have a long active life. And that's the problem and the dilemma you come across in any sport. Like any sport that you do at the highest level will have negative effects. It just will, especially the longer you do it. The longer somebody is professionally competitive weightlifter at a high level, the more likely they're going to have some problems later on in life because their body just takes a pounding to maintain these high loads all the time. Gymnasts that go longer and longer and longer and longer and longer, eventually they have some problems. So like you kind of have to weigh the risk reward. And I like what you were saying with the study being a good starting point. I think that's what CrossFit is learning now as still a younger sport is they need to be able to also suggest what some of the risks are to the sports side of CrossFit and then do their best to remove as many risks as possible. So something similar to, as people have played hockey and football longer and longer, there's more rules that come into play to try to take away the chances for some of the, more common injuries and side effects that happen in the long run. So long kind of winded answer to that person. But if we were having a conversation, I would say there's not a big difference. I don't think most people should be lowering heavy weights under fatigue. And if they're going to, then we have to really, really, really make sure that technique and capacity and absolute strength to be able to handle these things are maximized.
Yeah, and I think that, what you said initially, and Dave mentioned it early on, is that, one of the things you really have to look at is like, why are you doing it? If you're
Mm.
if you're doing it because it's your career and that's what the sport calls for and these other sorts of things, then okay, you do it, but you do it with caution and intelligently and all these other things. But if you're just your average everyday gym goer and the workout happens to say handstand push-ups in it, then you have to ask yourself, why are you doing the kipping version versus a strict version versus another modification? And if that answer is something other than this is the best movement to get the training adaptation that I'm after, then you really need to look harder at it, I think.
Yeah, we're gonna get a lot of I'm not listening to this crap from listeners out there that, aspire to be the next Frasers out there, the next Tias, who look at themselves in the gym and say, this is my chance to do the same workout that those guys did and compete and just see. It's like a World Series of poker, you put your 10K in and everybody has a chance to be the world champ. And so the buy-in part is hard. Like we can sit here and talk about this and just say what we think is the best for people to eat their vegetables, but it's not the buy-in part is what I think is going to be really difficult. There's going to be a lot of people who are like, yes, I completely agree, and I think we have to follow the steps and the progressions. But I still come back to you like the personality type that's doing CrossFit and is doing these things is about winning a lot of times, and
Yeah.
they look at every time they go in the gym as a competition as opposed to an opportunity to just get better.
I think
Mm.
that another thing that would maybe be helpful for people is to see what sort of workouts top level CrossFit Games athletes are really doing in their training. Like, are they really doing like a 30-minute Metcon every day on top of everything else they're doing? I mean, are they spending time doing accessory work, strict handstand work, these other things, or are they just going balls to the wall every time the clock counts 3, 2, 1, go? And I think that that's what most people think is happening, but it's not. And so you get
Yeah.
that little bit of enlightenment or exposure to what they're doing, and it could really change a lot of opinions,
Yeah.
hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I agree.
So my
Dave,
last
that
question for you.
Oh,
Oh,
Jordan,
sorry,
hold on.
Dave. Go ahead.
No. I just wanted to, that just kind of reminded me of one of the recent guests we had on the podcast, Alethea,
Mm.
and she was talking about being, now very, very veteran in multiple sports, weightlifting, gymnastics, and CrossFit. And we asked her some questions about her training and her movements, and she said that butterfly, even a lot of kipping, she holds off until right before a competition, and she focuses on strict, on deficit, on added weight, and on eccentrics to build her body up to be able to withstand what she'll put in the dynamic realm. So I think, at the end of the day too, even people that we work with that really want to be a competitor, there's usually such big holes in other areas of their game that like they would benefit from getting a lot stronger in a lot of areas prior to even trying to go into, more of these extremes like kipping.
Yeah, and Jordan, you can ask the last question, but I think all of us have done this more and more as we become older, and it's not so
Mm,
much just older, wiser situation. It just makes you feel better. Like
Yeah.
most of the pull work and the push work that I do these days, it's all strict. Like my pull up work, unless it's in a specific situation. This weekend I was in Italy and we did a workout with a bunch of our friends from Techno Gym out there, and the first part of the workout was all strict pull ups, and then we did kipping pull ups. And I was like, I haven't done kipping pull ups in a workout in a long time. Like, and it felt like a breeze, right? It was like, oh my God, like if I need to kip and my mobility is there, I could do 20, 30, 40 reps of kipping pull-ups in a row, no problem, because my strict strength allows me to do that. So I think that's exactly right. It's not that you're, you know, disregarding something from a competitive standpoint. You're actually creating the strength that's necessary for you able to apply it correctly once, the situation arises where you need it. So I think Alethia's approach is phenomenal. Like if there's anything that we took from a podcast recently for for an athlete looking to compete with longevity in mind, it's that comment that she made. I really appreciated it as an athlete that's looking to, in my mid 40s now, that's still looking to stay fit and in shape.
Yeah, and like to your point, not just any athlete, a 5 times game athlete, a 3 times
mm,
Commonwealth athlete, a collegiate athlete, uh, Australian gladiator, and a mother. I mean, and she's still competing. Like she gave
yeah.
birth, and then what was it like? Just a few months later, she went and competed at the Down Under Championships. It's like, good Lord, and
Yeah,
that's
she's not really from this planet, so it's hard for everyone else to be able
well,
to
no. This is an
but
opportunity to say that it's because she built a really good foundation and she's being smart.
she was a
Yeah,
gymnast and she was a
definitely.
kid too. So again, gymnastics, great foundation for anyone out there looking to have a kid. Gymnastics better than weightlifting. There we go. I got that
I
out.
was gonna say the same exact thing. You took the words out of my mouth, Dave.
What's the last
Okay.
question you got, Jordan?
Last question, because I'm sure people want to know is, you're teaching a class, has handstand push-ups in it. You've got a whole bunch of people of varying abilities. Some can do them strict, some can't. What are your go-to handstand push-up modifications to dole out to people in that scenario?
Uh, is Mike giving a response here, or is this purely
I
for
know,
me?
I know what Dave's gonna say.
Yeah.
Barbell strict press, because that's obviously the best one that you can do to sub in.
Well, I'll say this: whenever you're scaling or creating an option for an athlete, movement pattern should mimic what you're trying to do within the workout.
Mm,
And so I would always choose something that allows the person to create a really as perfect as possible tripod position, which means much more reliant on tricep activation as opposed to just the front of the shoulder doing the work. So find a movement pattern that you can repeat good tripod position with tricep activation as much as possible. So that's kind of part one. There's one that most people would go to, kind of a downward dog or a pike push-up type of an action. Anyone who's ever done those knows that they're challenging. They're not easy. In some cases, they're as hard as doing the handstand push-up for athletes. I remember early on in this podcast, we had Annie Sakamoto on, and we talked about this with her. And she's like, I actually find them to be harder than handstand pushes up against the wall. They're not super easy for a lot of people. So, in terms of keeping the difficulty high, but maybe decreasing the level of intensity with regards to having to be inverted, you can keep that intact by doing that type of movement pattern. Have no problem with people going down to their knees while still being able to create a good tripod position from that position down on the ground. Those to me are great. You can keep the same intensity as you would for someone that's really strong with handstand pushups and not have to do a kipping action. If you are going to do a strict press, I think a seated variation works well, and dumbbells work very well. So you can feel the independence of the weight, which I think translates a little bit better to feeling one arm doing maybe more work than the other, which is a little bit more reasonable to think when you're doing a handstand push-up. But I always like to understand that the movement pattern, if you're seeing this at all on video, but elbows being at 90 degrees. So instead of finishing kind of a front rack position with the weights close to your chest, the rep should mimic what you're trying to do. So hands in line with head, always coming back to a position where the elbows are at 90 degrees and keeping the weights kind of far from the head so you can mimic that same tripod position. It's a little different than maybe the way that you approach strict press work with dumbbells or barbell work from that tripod position, or excuse me, from that front rack position. But to me, it's a great way to make sure that you're mimicking the same movement pattern you want for the handstand push-up.
And then Dave, just for stimulus, for some of our stubborn listeners out there, full disclosure, this is sarcasm. I like to do a seated dumbbell variation to mimic kipping, where then somebody's throwing the medicine ball on the top of their head while they're pressing. It just gives a good, a good realistic approach to what's going to happen when you start kipping very aggressively.
Perfect. Mike, always thinking. See that?
Yeah.
Use that big head for something.
Well, that's because
Innovation.
he lets himself get hit in the head with a med ball often, so his brain is like primed and a lot of blood
Mush.
flow.
I did leave the gym the other day. I was trying to say bye to too many people at once. And, there's some of those like stand up barbell racks where you can just put the barbells in the little stand up. And I just biffed right into like all of them and knocked over like 2 safety bars, a hex bar, and 2 barbells.
You film like everything in your whole life, Mike. You didn't film that?
And I know it was like, that would have been great. It was like, I was smiling so big saying goodbye to everybody. Just boom, like knocked right into it. So
you got to see that. I'm sure there's a camera set up in the gym. See if you can get the footage from the camera inside the gym.
Yeah, I think there actually is. I'll see if I can get that for a future intro.
Just a comment on the workout that is going on for quarterfinals. The third workout has a lot of handstand push-ups in it. It's an interesting workout, very gymnastics heavy, handstand push-ups and muscle-ups and rope climbs and toes to bar and things like that. But if you notice in the workout description, it does not say kipping handstand push-up anywhere. However, the first variation, you are allowed to do kipping handstand push-up if you would like. It's not mandatory. You can do strict on the first. But the most interesting part to me is for the masters, as you get older, the more kipping handstand push-ups that you're going to end up doing. So the difficulty of the movement continues to increase, going from kipping to strict to wall facing for the elite athletes. And then it goes kipping, strict. And then it goes kipping, strict, but with a little bit of an elevation for your head for the masters athletes as you get older. So there is still some work to be done in terms of finding variations for the athletes as they get older to not just increase the reps of kipping that they do, to move in a direction where maybe they use another variation that takes some of that stress off their heads.
So I wonder, in that case where it says 10 kipping handstand push-ups, do they have to be kipping?
No, they don't. Okay. No. It says you can kip, but doesn't have to be kipping. So that's why they just say handstand push-ups. And then in the movement standards, it says, kipping is allowed in those ones where it just says handstand push-ups. So if you're Carrie Pierce, you can go ahead and do strict for everything and be faster than anyone kipping. So there are athletes out there that are capable.
Well,
anything else, guys?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it from my end and what I saw in our followers' comments and so forth.
Sweet. Well, I can't wait for the responses on this one. I'm sure there's going to be some additional pushback in terms of people's wantingness and willingness to put themselves in not great form. But that at this point, if you're listening to our podcast, where we come from with regards to form, technique, and longevity being at the forefront of the way that we teach things. So hopefully it's not surprising the take that we had on this, but we always appreciate the questions, the comments, and where people are working with athletes that have additional questions themselves. So send them in and we'll address them as best we can. We appreciate the time, guys, and we will be having another movement podcast very soon. I believe this podcast is coming out right after our Power Monkey Camp 21, which we just held out in Tennessee. If you're interested in coming hang out with us, we have Power Monkey Camp 2022 coming down the road at the end of September 24th to September 30th. You can find that information at powermonkeycamp.com, and also check out our app, Power Monkey Training, for a way to work with us and learn the way that we work on skill development. Take care.